Hello, everyone. I am Faith Atkins, a production specialist at BCAN, and we are so glad that you decided to join us here tonight for Authors with Jack Carr. And if you enjoy this program, please consider joining us for our next event, Authors with Dr. Jody Berg and Farmer Lee Jones on May 6th, and Authors with Ted Long on May 19th. The library is also offering several virtual book clubs. You can find full event details by visiting toledolibrary.org and clicking on programs. I want to take time to thank our presenting sponsor, the Library Legacy Foundation, for their generous financial support. We are also incredibly grateful to the presenting media sponsors, The Blade and Buckeye Broadband, and our supporting sponsor, Buer Group, and our community sponsor, the Friends of the Library. This program is being recorded tonight and will be uploaded to the library YouTube channel. So staff will be monitoring Facebook Live and the Zoom chat functions. So please be sure to send in any questions throughout the presentation. I am pleased to introduce our moderator for the evening, the Executive Director of the Toledo-Lucas County Public Library, Jason Kutchma. Welcome, Jason.
Thanks, Faith. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. And now a little more about our featured author and his book. So James Reese is back in the devil's hand. It has been 20 years since 9/11, 2 decades since the United States was attacked on home soil and embarked on 20 years of war. The enemy has been patient, learning and adapting, and is ready to strike again. A new president offers hope to a country that's weary of conflict. He is a young, popular, self-made visionary, but he's also a man with a secret. The Devil's Hand is a riveting and timely thriller that will leave you grasping for breath. Author Jack Carr led special operations teams as the team leader, platoon commander, troop commander, and task unit commander. He uses his 20 years of experience in the Navy to bring an impressive level of reality to his best-selling novels. He currently lives with his wife and 3 children in Park City, Utah. Everyone, welcome Jack Carr.
All right, success.
Hey, Jack.
Yeah,
right.
Awesome. How's it going?
Excellent, excellent. Where do we find you tonight, Jack? Thank you, Faith.
Home in Park City, Utah. Faith, thank you so much. Awesome. But yeah, home in Park City, Utah. So this is a temporary office for anybody that's followed me on socials before. In the last house, I had my books surrounding me, behind me. Now they're all up in front of me here, but they're on this industrial type bookshelf because it's a just temporary, and we're looking for another place to call home. So so I have them all right here, but it just doesn't look quite as nice as it used to in the old house. So
it looks pretty permanent. We have the Devil's Hand behind me. You've got it right behind, over your shoulder as well.
Awesome.
This is a very different book tour than you're used to doing, right? Because you're typically on the road.
Well, last one, Savage Sun, launched April 12th of 2020. Yeah, so things had shut down a few weeks earlier, and it was really the first time that the publisher couldn't go back and say, well, what we did in the last pandemic was X, Y, and Z, and this worked and this didn't, so let's do this. It was really kind of the height of the uncertainty when we didn't know about, people were worried about their health, the health of parents and children. Kids are out of school, they're worried about finances and work and everything else. So it was really an interesting time to launch a book. And so typically what I did was, I tried to push as much business as I could towards independent bookstores by doing some book plates like similar to this. I did it again this time. That you can only get from those independent bookstores because they were hurting. They had 0 foot traffic. Most of them were shut down, especially last April. So so tried to get as many people to call independent bookstores that were still open, as far as just having someone there to send out books. So trying to give a little added incentive to do that. So so that was great. And then really talked about preparedness at the time because some people felt unprepared, and both financially, like safety wise, with food, kids at home. And it was just such a strange time to launch a book. So that was a very long way of me saying that this one is still similar to last time. Yeah.
It's that precarity has not, it's just changed different focus now. Like before there was these uncertainties about what we were going to do about supplies, and there's still all these big questions hanging out in front of us.
Yeah, we have different uncertainties now. But yeah, it was just a strange one because, I mean, the kids, we were locked down in the house. I mean, we weren't even going out, and our boxes would come to the house, and we were like, letting them sit for a while before we even opened them. Like we didn't know last end of March, early April of last year. So I think there's a little more, I guess, stability this time around, but not much, but a little more.
Yeah. How old are the kids?
So we have 15, 13, and 10.
Okay.
Yeah, total chaos. They
I'll,
were all here in the house helping me write this novel.
I'm
Those who are
sure.
working from home can relate. As soon as you close those doors to the office, it's like a magnet. Just there they
Yeah.
are.
Well, I started coming back into the office sometime around early November, and yeah, not having, well, my kids have been in school, but I've got six, almost 7-year-old twins, and exactly those first those weekends are tough to get anything done.
Oh yeah, yeah. They might join us on this podcast, this interview. So let's.
That would be great. That'd be great if they joined us. I saw a picture of you on social in front of this gorgeous big glass window. Is that the house where you are right now, or is that a special writing
That's probably the last
utopia?
house. Yeah, that
That
was
was
the
it.
last house. Yeah, it was nice, but it was one of those places that that photographed well. But when it came down to actually living there, it was a little didn't work out the way we'd envisioned when we
Yeah.
got it. We envisioned the kids being on their floors, and we could say go to your floor. And what ended up happening is that we all stayed in the main area, kind of right off where those big, huge glass windows were, with beautiful views and everything. But and my office was right off that as well. So it was like everyone was packed into a smaller space, even though we had all this extra space, and it just didn't work out the way we thought. So hence we're looking for a new spot.
Yeah. Well, I can guarantee it's probably not snowing in Utah right now, is it?
No,
Because
but it
it
was
is
a couple
here.
days ago. Yeah, it was a couple
Yeah,
days.
we're getting that tonight in Ohio, and it's typical April in Ohio where we got some snow coming down. But well, let's chat about the book a little bit. For the folks that have not been, and I will tell you, I'm a new James Reese fan. It started with The Devil's Hand, and then I went back and read Terminalist, and so I've got the other two in between still.
Oh, wow.
I'm right in the middle of True Believer, and so I've been hooked. And for the folks that haven't had a chance to pick up any of your 4 books, if when I talk to you, when you've had 20 of them under your belt, I will not ask you to do this, but I was curious if you could sort of give us a little bit of an origin story and tell us about how James Reese came to be and where we find him now.
Yeah, sure will. And actually, so when I started down this path, I started writing in about December of 2014. I was still in the military at the time, but I decided to get out. I decided to get out probably a year, 2 years before that, and I knew it was just time to get out and focus on my family. It had been a good run up to that point, but I wouldn't tactically be leading guys on the battlefield again. So when I got, because I'd be at this rank where you come back as a commanding officer, but
Mhm.
really, which sounds impressive, but really you're a manager at that point. You're back in the tactical operations center. You're not out kicking the doors in with the guys doing that job that most of us came in to do. So I got home, decided to get out, and what I wanted to do since I was a little kid, other than serve my country in uniform, was write fiction, because I grew up with this love of books, love of reading. My mom was a librarian, still is a librarian, and I just naturally gravitated towards fiction that had protagonists with backgrounds I wanted in real life one day. So at about age 10, about 5th grade, I started reading the things that my parents were reading, for sure by 6th grade, but I think I started it in 5th, and that's when Hunt for Red October came out, of
Mhm.
course, and then I found David Morrell, I found Nelson DeMille, I found A.J. Quinnell, J.C. Pollock, Mark Olden, Stephen Hunter. I found all these authors with these protagonists that typically had Vietnam experience back then in the 80s. That's what the protagonists had. They were either Marine snipers or SEALs or Army Special Forces or CIA operatives or something along those lines. And I just loved them. I loved the magic of reading these books. So I always knew that's what I was going to do. So once again, long way of saying, when I started writing, I wrote down all these different ideas. I wrote down about 6, 7, 8 different one-page executive summaries. And the one I wanted to start with was Savage Son, was the third one. And that's because, well, in 6th grade, I read Most Dangerous Game, which is a short story written by Richard Connell back in 1924. And I always knew that even back then in 6th grade, that one day I'd write a thriller that paid tribute to that short story. So I really wanted to start with that one. But I knew that the characters weren't developed enough to explore the theme of Savage Son, which was really the dark side of man, to the dynamic of hunter and hunted. So I knew I needed to get the characters to that point where I could explore those themes. And it just, of all those ideas I had, it was very clear that I needed to start with the Terminalist. And in the Terminalist, the reader meets James Reese. He's a former Navy SEAL sniper, becomes an officer. So his background is very similar to mine. So I got to tap into a lot of that. And when the reader meets him, he's on his last deployment. And he knows that when he gets back from that last deployment, once again, he's not going to tactically lead guys in the battlefield again, and it's time to take care of his family. So I was in the same mindset as my character when I started writing. Of course, for him, the disaster strikes both on the battlefield and on the home front, and he's pulled into this conspiracy where the government, a government and private consortium, is testing drugs on our nation's most elite soldiers, which I got from the church hearings in the 70s, where a bunch of abuses by different agencies of the federal government were brought to light. And so that kicks off the Terminalist, and that I wanted him to go into battle thinking he was already dead. I wanted him free from any sort of constraint. So that one was all about revenge without constraint. The second one, True Believer, moves into a journey of redemption. And then Savage Son was the one I always wanted to write since 6th grade. And then that brings us up to The Devil's Hand.
And we find, so and I'm going to apologize already, because even in talking about being able to interview you and reading your books, I'm going to call you James Reese on occasion and reference Jack Carr in all of your books. So
that does happen from time to time. Don't worry. I won't take offense.
It's pretty remarkable. So, starting with the Terminalist, no constraints. He's working in sort of morally ambiguous territory. And where do we find him in The Devil's Hand without, 4 books, in the 4th book, where do we find him now in this book?
Yeah, so just like anything, I wanted my characters to evolve. Just like in life, we're all on a journey, and I wanted my characters to be on a journey as well. So when I'm writing, I'm thinking of, hey, how do these stories that stand alone as individual stories, but with a character that's growing, that's evolving, that's adapting, because that's what we're all doing in real life. Hopefully, is building on these foundations and working our way towards places we want to go. Hopefully, we're enjoying the journey. Hopefully, we're inspiring people along the way. But I didn't want to have my characters that just remain static for every book. And I just picked up those same characters, and they didn't change at all, and they drop them into a new scenario, and then move them in. So I wanted them to be on this journey, just like everyone, because I think we can all relate to that. So in The Devil's Hand, I really wanted to explore something that I thought about a lot while I was in uniform, and that I continue to think about a lot today as a citizen and an author, which is, what has the enemy learned by watching us on the field of battle for the last 20 years now at war? And in that first one, you can read The Terminalist a few different ways, and they're actually adapting it right now to film in LA. Chris Pratt starring as my protagonist, and there's like 350 people out there on set making it happen. It's crazy. But as I was writing, I wanted people to be able to go as deep as they wanted into that as I explored that theme of revenge. If people could just grab it off the shelf and you had a great political thriller, and they escape for a little bit and that's it, or they could go a little deeper and realize that, hey, this is about somebody who is abandoning everything that he has not just fought for as an adult, but studied his entire adult life. The way he's abandoned everything, and become essentially the terrorist, become the insurgent that at that point he'd been fighting for 16 years at war. And then you can go a little deeper too, and it's really about somebody, a veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan, who is bringing those wars home to the front doors of people who have been sending young men and women to their deaths now for coming up on 20 years. But so there's a few different ways you can read that one, and each of my novels I think has those elements to it, and I think that's why it resonated with Simon & Schuster, who sees thousands of these things cross their desk every year, and why it's resonating with readers, and why it resonated with Chris Pratt, and why he optioned it before it even hit the shelf. And that's because what I take from my time in uniform aren't necessarily the exact tactics and weapons and that sort of thing, which of course is very helpful, but taking those feelings and emotions behind certain experiences downrange and applying those to a completely fictional novel. And I didn't expect that at the outset. When I sat down to write, I thought it was just going to be, I'm going to write a great story here. That's what I thought. And that's what I thought when I wrote that one-page executive summary. That's what I thought when I did the outline. But as soon as I sat down to actually write the first chapter, well, then it became very clear that I was going to be incorporating a lot of these feelings and emotions, and it was going to be a much more personal writing experience than I initially anticipated. So that carries over into The Devil's Hand as well. And what I'm exploring there is, hey, what if I was Iran? What if I was China? What if I was North Korea? What if I was a terrorist organization or a super empowered individual? And I had 20 years to study the United States on the field of battle in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, a couple other hotspots around the world. Essentially, what I'd be doing is watching the United States play poker, looking at their cards. How do they play those cards? Okay, I see how they're doing this. Take some lessons and apply it to my future battle plans when I'm playing poker against them. So that's really what I did, and I outlined that in August of 2019. And I was flying to and from Russia at the time to do some research for Savage Sun for my third one. That book was pretty much done, but I hadn't put boots on the ground in Kamchatka Peninsula, which is just south of Siberia, and and I wanted to get that local flavor because I'd gone to Mozambique for the second one. I'd gone to South Africa. I'd already been to Morocco. I'd been to Ukraine. I'd been to Iraq, Afghanistan. I'd been to a lot of these places. So I wanted to put boots on the ground in Russia, in Kamchatka Peninsula. So I left my computer behind, left my phone behind, because who knows what people have sent me over the years with my past in special operations. I brought a sat phone and my notebook, and I outlined the whole thing, and the whole fourth novel on that flight. And so that was really the foundation, is stepping into the enemy's shoes and looking at our country from the enemy's perspective, essentially what we call in the military red selling something. And so then I got home, finished up Savage Sun, and started researching. And the catalyst that moves the plot forward in The Devil's Hand is really the bioweapons and the weaponization of infectious diseases. So that's what I started studying. So of course, when COVID hits, I'm hypersensitive to that.
Yeah.
And also, I didn't realize in August of 2019 how pivotal of a year 2020 was going to be. It was just, hey, this is just something I wanted to explore. I wanted to look at the United States from the enemy's perspective. But by the time we got to February, March last year, well, the enemy's learning from our response to COVID. And then we hit a summer of civil unrest that continues today. Enemy's learning from that. We had a very contentious political season and election cycle. Once again, the enemy is learning from that and figuring out how to leverage all these things against us. So the book became much more timely than I thought it was going to be in August of 2019 when I outlined it.
It's remarkable. I mean, as I'm reading it, and that was one of the questions I was like, when were you writing this? So August, when did you complete this? Because there's so many details in here that feel like they were from last week or last month.
Well, final edits were in January. So the final refinements were in January, but yeah, it was over a year, obviously, of being in the enemy's shoes. About the first 4 months of that was just straight research, reading articles and journals, medical journals and periodicals, books, interviews, that sort of thing. Just getting an understanding of what it means, or what really a history of infectious diseases and the weaponization of those diseases from World War II up through today. Like what did Japan do in World War II? Who did they use a bioweapons program against? What happened to that data and research after the war? Same thing with Germany. And the answer is the data and research from both those countries informed the bioweapons program of the then Soviet Union and the United States. And then what did it mean when we signed these conventions in the 70s on bioweapons and that sort of thing? So the first part was deep research, and I got very lucky because I didn't need to travel for this one. And with everything shutting down with COVID, I could still do my research. I could still reach out on phone calls to people to interview. I could still read these books and read these articles and jot down these questions and ask people much more knowledgeable than I am on these subjects. Because in the military, I had no touch point with anything in the realm of bioweapons. Didn't know that most of my what I learned about bioweapons came from The Hot Zone by Richard Preston back in the 90s. But other than that, I never really studied it either academically or as something I needed to do in the military. So it was starting from scratch, really. And I learned that a lot of what we read or in thrillers or we see in movies or on TV shows is just that. It's a lot of Hollywood. So I got to talk to people who have had touch points studying infectious diseases, and this is the first time I got to really be a journalist, I felt. Because the other ones I'm writing, they're all made up, of course, but I'm bringing in personal experiences and that sort of thing, and I'm checking a lot of things. If I'm interested in something, I'm researching it, but it's out there. And this was the first one where a lot of what I was writing isn't out there in one place. And much like a journalist wouldn't just read one book and then write about a subject, I was doing the same thing. I was reading all these different books and articles and journals, talking to all these different people so I could put this puzzle together, because all of them leave out something, especially when you're talking to someone that has a touch point working with infectious diseases. Well, they're leaving things out, but the next person might say what this other person left out and leave out something else. And so when you talk to enough people and read enough articles and then start reading enough books, and you can start weaving this tapestry together and putting this puzzle together like I did for this. So this was the first time that I felt like I was doing the job of a journalist, because I didn't have that foundation in infectious diseases or bioweapons.
And so, and it's incredibly well researched, obviously, and I think that shows. And you've mentioned how how's the enemy been watching us for the last 20 years. You've certainly dove deeper into biological warfare and even just infectious diseases than many of us lay folks have done, or non-authors. What do you have a different perspective on how we've dealt with this last year or so than maybe others do?
Well, I really went, I kind of went in character. So I did all
Mhm.
that from the enemy's perspective. It's like, I never thought of it in those terms yet, though, before. So when I look at COVID and I look at mortality rate versus infection rates, and then I see, if I'm the enemy, I'm looking and I say, look what this country did with something with a, point zero zero, whatever it is, mortality rate. What if we release something with an 80%, 85%, 90%? If they shut down for this thing, what are they going to do when it's at 90%? And so that got me thinking. So the enemy is definitely looking at that. They're not just looking at any of these things with a passing interest. They are looking at all of these things as data points as they incorporate them and figure out how to exploit these vulnerabilities, or at least take that knowledge and apply that knowledge to their future battle plans. So I think that was the main takeaway, is that the enemy sure learned a lot about us over this last year.
Sure. And without giving anything away, and as you were talking about this, like what do we do with an 80 to 90% disease? I know what the government's response was because I read the book. Is that even remotely? Is that based in anything that's fact,
So
or
this is one of those
whatever
things.
you could share?
Yeah, no, this is one of those things that as I'm talking to all these different people, I'm researching all these different articles, and I'm not just looking at our program. I'm looking at Soviet program. I'm looking at China. I'm looking at North
Mhm.
Korea. I'm looking at Iran. I'm doing all I can to kind of to inform the novel. And I would be shocked if we don't have something like in place, a protocol in place like the one I describe in the novel. I mean, I have no one told me that we do, but
Sure.
in all that research that I did and thinking about things from the enemy's perspective and going back to World War II up to today, I would be shocked if we did not have something in place like I describe in the novel.
Speaking of which, you're in the book. You've got a sort of author's note at the end. In the audiobook, Ray Porter's your
Yeah,
narrator, right?
yeah, fantastic. I love
I
that
want to
guy.
ask you about him in a second, but you read this sort of disclaimer at the top about what kind of hoops you have to jump through as an author who is a former SEAL. Can you talk a little bit about that and what that means and how that sort of flavors the narrative, or how people can how it frames it for folks?
So the author's note in this one, so the author's
Yeah.
note in this one is different. So I haven't done an author's note before. I've done a preface in the
Okay.
others that frames what people are gonna read, kind of
Hmm.
sets the tone. But this is the first time that because it was so research intensive, this is the first time I had an author's note, so that when someone gets to the end, I figured they might be curious. Hey, what was fact? What was fiction about what I just read? Kind of like the things we're talking about right now.
Sure.
And so I wrote an author's note so that people would there would be a point of reference for them, for people that have those types of questions. So that's at the end. But the other ones, yes, I submitted to the Department of Defense because they were so closely tied to what I did in the military, and because this one was not tied towards anything that I did in the military. I didn't because the 30 days that the DoD
Mm.
says they'll get back to you in turns into 7 months. So they're not big readers over there at the Department. It was a shock for anyone reading or listening to this, but yeah, there's just no way to stay on track doing that. So this one had nothing to do with anything that I did in the military. It was all based on research that I got from magazine articles and medical journals and interviews and other books and that sort of thing. So yeah, this one didn't go through that.
James Reese has a very complicated relationship with the federal government. Can you talk about that a little bit, and maybe how much of I'm curious as I'm reading this. Of course, as I know, knowing that a lot of this is informed by your experience, I was curious how much of there is that overlap between Reese and yourself in thinking about that.
Yeah, I'm not going to let anybody get off, especially at the strategic levels in either the military or the political realm in my novels. They tend to take some
Mhm.
hits, and that's because they give me so much to work with in real life. From personal experience and just things that I see on the news, just like everybody else. So I'm certainly not a loss for developing senior level military and politicians as characters. Um, but yeah, I think a lot of it's informed from my experience. Probably a lot of it comes from seeing how at the tactical level we're expected to do a certain job. Tactical level meaning you're out there, you're
Mhm.
kicking doors, you're doing that job, you're building packages, you're taking people off the battlefield, that sort of thing. So if we had made decisions at that level that were similar to the kind that were made at the strategic level for us, like we'd be kicked out of the military, we'd be court-martialed and sent home from deployment, and we'd never operate again. We'd be done. Yet senior level military and politicians, they make these decisions that at the strategic level are just
Mhm.
atrocious and based on not understanding the nature of the conflict in which we're engaged, and that is their only job. Their only job is to study the history of where we're going, and set our strategic goals and priorities and figure out, hey, how we're going to get there based on what we're going to do at the tactical level to meet those strategic objectives. And they have not done well in that realm. Most of us can see because we're still in these countries 20 years later. We've had shifting goals. If we think about Iraq, we had decisions made where we essentially created the insurgency that we then got mirrored down in, well, up through today, really, because we're still dealing with the after effects of that. So disbanding an army after you just have essentially, quote unquote, won, whatever that means,
Mhm.
and then de-Baathification. So it means anybody who was a Baathist couldn't hold a job. Okay, so everyone was a Baathist, or else you're going to get shot. So that means everyone from the person who takes out the garbage, to the person who runs the power grid, to obviously the elected politicians, or not elected politicians, the politicians, to people in the military. Like none of those people had jobs anymore. So you're essentially starting from scratch and building up an entire country. While at the same time, you have created an insurgency. You put everyone out of work. A lot of people you put out of work also have military experience,
Mhm.
and then you have outside sources like from Iran fueling those fires. So we were, yeah, I call it imperial hubris. We went in there, we thought that commitment was the
Mhm.
same thing as victory. We thought commitment equated to victory, both in Afghanistan and Iraq. So yeah, I don't let the senior level leaders off in these things, especially when they've proven to be so inept at their jobs in real life.
Sure, sure. What's your take on our withdrawal from Afghanistan, or the plans coming up?
Yeah, no, I think that you have 20 years. I mean, you have to decide if being there indefinitely is worth it for a strategic goal. So we went in there really to disrupt and destroy Al Qaeda operations. Okay, so we
Mhm.
went there. We spent a lot of time doing that. We did that initially a lot faster than most people thought that we would. And then we decided to rebuild the country, and we decided to combat corruption, which is just a part of the political system in that country, regardless.
Mhm.
Uh, and we decided to figure out how to influence these safe havens and sanctuaries in Iran and Pakistan. So we just expanded the scope of the operation, and we're still there today.
Yeah.
So for me, and when I was there, even they had this saying, and they said, "Hey, the Americans have all the watches, but we have all the time." And that's true. And when you study what's called expeditionary counterinsurgency, meaning you're not countering an insurgency on home soil, you're going elsewhere to do it. That is a long process. That's a 30, 40-year type investment. And also, the world's changed in the last 20 years. Before September 11th, it was important to have a physical location to train and plan. Um, Today, it's not as necessary because we can do these things virtually. We can
Mhm.
plan, we can train virtually. And then we also need to remember that the plan for September 11th was really conceived in the Philippines. It was greenlit from Afghanistan, but then the tactical level planning was done in Hamburg, Germany, San Diego, California, Phoenix, Arizona, Florida. So you don't need to actually have that. I mean, it's helpful obviously to have a place where people can train. And for throughout the 90s, the terrorist training camps and into early 2000s in Afghanistan definitely did turn out some terrorists that then went around the world to do certain things. But if we're talking about 9/11, a lot of that was done outside of Afghanistan, and that is even more prevalent and relevant today. So all these things need to be incorporated in the calculus. So yeah, I think it's probably and the way we honor those people who didn't come home or that came home experiencing that emotional and physical trauma of the battlefield is to take those lessons and apply them going forward. So that's about. I mean, it's so tough to say, especially to families that have lost someone over there in Iraq or Afghanistan. But
Sure.
learning from these lessons and applying them going forward, that's what we need to do to honor those that didn't make it back.
Yeah, and unfortunately, as you were saying, those lessons aren't necessarily learned universally across the board from leadership, where we'd like to see that happening.
Yeah, we tend to think in 4-year terms, maybe 8 years for the real deep thinkers among us. And then, of course, we have adversaries who have histories that go back a lot longer than ours does, eons, essentially. So when we're talking about Iran, or you're talking about China, I mean, these countries have some serious history, and they're thinking a lot longer than a 4-year election cycle.
There's a theme or a thread in your novels of this asymmetrical warfare. Can you talk a little bit about what that means for folks that may not understand that?
Yeah, so asymmetric warfare, the best way to describe it is David versus Goliath. So someone that's big and strong over here and someone that's not here. So what do you do? So that's asymmetric. It's not symmetric here together. So what do you do? And it's an interesting thing to think about, because let's say Goliath wins. Well, what happens? So you just picked on someone that was weaker than you, or David wins. Oh well, how did you possibly lose to this guy, to this group? They're running around with AKs and homemade explosives and some RPGs that don't work half the time. And you've been there for 20 years, or you've been they're bringing this superpower to its knees. Well, let's go back and study our history. Look at how much trouble Genghis Khan had when he went through Afghanistan. Let's look at Alexander the Great, how much trouble he had in Afghanistan, and they didn't have any rules back then. And then look at the British, 3 different excursions into Afghanistan in the 19th and early 20th century. So we have data, of course, and even more recently, the Soviets in 1979 going in. So we have data, and we can research these things. But once again, I think we tend to fall prey to this imperial hubris at some of those senior levels.
What's the answer? Where do we go instead of that? And what's the alternative?
I would hope that people would study their history, would go to the library,
right?
Time in the stacks. My goodness!
I put that one on a T for you. I was
Seriously, it drives me crazy. But I mean, that's what I hope. Instead, what we have are people that are basing their opinions on things from a 1-sentence or 2-sentence tweet from someone who also didn't spend time at the library. So I mean, that's what we have. So it's tough, because it's hard to. I don't know how you combat that. It's extremely difficult, especially when things are moving so fast. There's so many distractions, and then you have social media that essentially is weaponized to divide us. That's one reason I started my podcast, so that because I get all these questions all the time on social media, and I see that some of these questions, the answers are not even the answers, because they're discussions. Really, they're not quote unquote answer, but they lend themselves more to a nuanced discussion if you're going to be thoughtful about things, which is what we certainly owe future generations if we're going to be making decisions that are going to impact our children and grandchildren. But that's why I started this podcast called Danger Close: Beyond the Books with Jack Carr. One episode drops every Wednesday, but it's because that is the platform where I can talk about these things more in depth, and you can say something, and then there's body language, there's intonations in the voice, and you can say, oh, you know what, I don't know if that came off quite right. What I meant to say really is this. Does that make sense? And you can have this conversation rather than a 1-sentence thing on there that people can interpret however they want based on whatever filters they are looking through that day. So it's I would hope, and I try to encourage people, or I talk about it as much as I possibly can, the importance of putting in the requisite time, energy, and effort into the study of history, to the study of these issues, before all of a sudden we jump on a bandwagon, or we just, because of one sentence that some quote unquote influencer put out there, or a politician who might be gaining votes or solidifying a base because they're intentionally being divisive. It's up to us as citizens to do that research ourselves. I mean, we have these wonderful library system across the country. We can go to these places, and there's so many distractions online. There's such a difference, I think, between opening a book and just researching something online. You can Google anything. So
Mhm.
it's so with our kids, like I try to, that's why I have all these, well, not the only reason, but I love books. I've had books all over the place growing up. But there's a difference between having a book on the shelf and just knowing that it's accessible online. So if we talk about, like, let's say the Declaration of Independence,
Yeah.
like we have a physical copy of that in a little leather bound thing. Actually, it's right here. I was referencing it earlier. So it's leather, and it goes, so it
Mm.
just shows that, hey, this is different. These books out here are different than just Googling something, because everything is here on this machine somewhere. But that means that I'm putting things that are of such importance in history on the same level as, who's a Kardashian dating. Like, those things are, that when you have it in the computer, those things are almost, they're almost the same because it's all here. But you know what? Some of those things, like we just talked about there, are not on the shelf. I can't go to the shelf here and find out this some Kardashian thing, or some, whatever else that won't mean much in the long run. But I can go here, and I can go into any of these books on history. I have all these books on warfare and terrorism and insurgencies and counterinsurgencies, and they're all organized here. So it's just different, if that makes sense. And everyone has access to that at their library, at their local library. It's just, they're all there.
All right, that's it. We're going to wrap it up right now after that. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. It's perfect. I mean, you're 100% right. And we talk about that a lot here because, we struggle in thinking about media literacy and helping people understand and make sense of the information that they get through social media or through, news media. And it's hard because nobody wants to say, I'm not media literate, right? Or I don't understand the media. And so it's difficult because people think they come to that with their sort of innate understanding that, that what they're reading is fact or what have you. And it's really difficult to do that with folks. But you're right. I think the library is a good antidote
Yeah,
for that.
turn off the phone, the distractions, and get into these books. Do the research, the way we used to have to do it. Because I think a good way to frame it is, and I frame it this way for our kids, is that well, there's two different things. One is that you could initially, just right off the bat, just assume that if something's a contentious issue, that if you're getting that one tweet about it, that whoever is tweeting that is benefiting from dividing, from
Mhm.
incendiary, and just assume that off the bat. It might not be the case, but it's a good assumption to go into. It's good to be skeptical of
Mhm.
things going into it on that side of the house. And then if you are going to jump in on any of this, don't say something on social media that you wouldn't say to someone if you were locked in an elevator with them, stuck between
Mhm.
floors. Be respectful, be thoughtful in your responses or engagement, because if not, things just degenerate so quickly. It's
Even still,
a waste of time.
even if you're on that elevator, you'd have the chance to explain nuance and context, which you do not have any of that opportunity to do in social
Oh, you
media,
get
right? I
one
mean,
sentence and it's like squirrel,
yeah, yeah. Well, so that's interesting. I don't know that I fully recognize the role that media plays in the James Reese universe, and it certainly it's its own antagonist. Is that on the horizon for him? Maybe a more pointed look at how social media influences our society and our culture?
Probably.
Or
I've woven it into to this one. There's some touch points in here about
Mhm.
that. But I've been thinking about it for future novels, just because we have so much power now, and wealth just accumulated with such a small number of people. And it's not so much the wealth part of it; it's the control of information part of it. Look back at like Standard Oil or whatever. Like, okay, yeah, incredible wealth, and I'm sure that they had reporters, on the payroll to put stories here, and that's how you manipulated things back then. You either
Right.
blackmailed certain reporters, or you paid certain reporters to put something about you or your company in a good light. And then obviously that's not every reporter. Obviously, that's just
Right.
But that was your option. Now there's so many options. There's so many ways to weaponize information or to skew things or to spin things. But really, it's not necessarily about the wealth at those higher levels. But that's incredible to think about. It's that control of the flow of information. So and the ability to manipulate information and thereby manipulate a population, which is incredible. So I'm sure I will explore those themes in future novels.
So we did have somebody who's watching tonight ask a little bit about James Reese, and we'll talk about that in a second. You've been out of service for how many years now?
I got out in summer of 2016.
How fit are you right now?
Not quite as fit as I was. Doing a lot of typing these days, not so much working out.
Yeah, it's, I think one of the things that really draws, I'm somebody who grew up in the suburbs, have had no experience in the military. I thank you for your service to the country, but there's something about reading about somebody who is just exceptionally good at what they do. And there's a little bit of you in there, but I have to imagine that there's plenty of your fellow SEALs in there as well.
Oh yeah, I mean my protagonist is much faster than I ever was, much stronger, much better jiu-jitsu, much better boxer, much better shot than I could ever hope to have been. But I also wanted to humanize him. I wanted him to be somebody that you want to sit down and have a beer with, sit down and have a coffee with. That was important to me as well, because a lot of this, like a misconception about SEALs or special operations in general, is that you're almost these robots, or you're like what you're portrayed as on in movies or that sort of thing. And so I wanted to humanize him. So it's important that he was likable, but also he needed to flip that switch and be able to get the business done. So that's James Reese. He can flip that switch and get it done because he has the training and he has the skills. And certainly in that first book, everything has been stripped away from him that frees him up to do what he does in that novel. And really, because I remember growing up in the 80s, every time there'd be a movie that had the theme of revenge, you'd have that voiceover. There's two guys, I think, in the 80s that did the voiceovers for all those movies. They were so fantastic. But there was always be like, he has nothing left to lose. That was always in there. And I remember always watching these things, and I loved all those movies, but I remember always thinking, well, he has something left to lose, like he could die. I just always remember. And so I wanted James Reese to go into battle thinking he was already dead, hence that the drugs in the system from this conspiracy to test drugs on our nation's most elite soldiers. And I got that from Japanese Bushido, from the Code of the Samurai. And samurai would go into battle thinking they were already dead because that made them more effective and efficient warriors. So I thought, hey, how do I bring that to a modern day warrior in James Reese? And then of course I have the tomahawk, which you can see on the wall behind me there.
Yes.
Kind of an ancient, not necessarily ancient weapon, but it's an old school weapon right there that has a lot of history and heritage to it. And I wanted to have that kind of be the bridge that James Reese, he's a modern warrior, but he has roots in the past. Like, this is in his DNA. He was born to this. It was a calling, and the tomahawk really symbolizes that.
I will have to say, speaking of the tomahawk, and I was going to ask you about that. That is a sort of brand for your sort of media empire that you're building, right? But I found myself a number of times, because you rattle through all kinds of different gear, and I find myself looking stuff up, like, what does that tomahawk look like? What does gear mean to you as an author? Because you're very intentional about it.
Yeah, so I was a gear guy before the military, obviously a gear person in the military, and then continue to, we call it gear guy today. And just growing up, I was one of the things that would allow me to go further and faster into the backcountry. In the military, I was always looking for things that would make us more effective and efficient on the battlefield, and a lot of times those didn't come from the military. The private sector typically is light years ahead of the military, because we have a procurement process, which takes time. And by the time you finally get something good in the system, there's something better out there, because the private sector is just driven to innovate, whereas the military is like driven to wait for someone else to innovate, then find it, then put it through testing, and then put it through put it out for bid, and then by the time you finally get it 4 years later, there's something else that you want. So So I've been deep into gear and weapons my whole life, but which also means that when I see somebody using something, it tells me a lot about them. Whether they're carrying like a 1911 pistol in a leather holster on a leather belt, that tells me something about them. Or it could be a striker fire pistol in a Kydex holster on a nylon belt. Well, what does that tell me about the person?
Mhm.
So the way what people carry, how they carry it, just like what they drive, it tells me a story. So I use all these things as character development tools in the novels, and sometimes some of these weapons are characters in and of themselves.
Are you wearing Salomon boots right now?
I have socks on, but I do have my Solomons right there. Yeah, yeah, right outside. But typically around here, we kick our shoes off because there's so much
Yeah.
mud, the snow, and all that stuff.
I'll admit, I drink my coffee black, but after I read that, I did have to try it with some honey. Not bad. It's pretty good.
There you
Pretty
go.
good.
Gotta go
Yeah.
local. Gotta go local honey. So you get those. Yeah, it helps with
Build up with the allergens, right?
yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of allergens, I'm a kid who grew up with asthma and I'm allergic to everything in the world. And so even fascinated by the fact that, Reese can just pack up and go with a backpack, because I would still be putting my over the counter prescriptions, my inhaler. Like I couldn't go anywhere on short notice like that, but it's always remarkable.
Gotta keep taking that honey.
Right. So you said you wanted to be a writer very young, but you went into the military and spent 2 decades. That is a tremendous amount of time to do research. Uh, what was that experience? I mean, what drove you to join the military?
Yeah, so I looked at them as two separate and distinct, different professions. Now, of course, it's clear to me that they're connected. But growing up, my grandfather was killed in World War II, so I grew up with pictures of him in his squadron. He was a Marine
Mhm.
aviator, so he flew a plane that had the gold wings called the Corsair. People might remember the show called Black Sheep Squadron in the late
Mhm.
70s, early 80s
Mhm.
with Robert Conrad portraying Pappy Boynton. So I'd watch that show with my dad and absolutely loved it. And had these silk maps they used to give aviators back then, because if you hit the water with a paper one, it would disintegrate. So you had these silk maps, and I
Wow.
still had those from him. Had his medals, that sort of thing. So I just felt this calling to military service from a very early age. And then I found out what SEALs were at age 7. And I saw a movie. I saw parts of a movie called The Frogman, an old black and white film. And
Mhm.
we're asking my dad, because I got to watch football on the weekends with my dad, but I wasn't really interested in football. I was interested in the commercial breaks, because we had like ABC, CBS, NBC, and that one Outlier channel back then. And the
Yeah.
Outlier channel on Sundays always had a war movie. So I'd watch football with my dad, and then at the commercial, he'd look at his watch and say, go. And I'd run up, because I was a remote control back then.
Right.
Kids in the 70s can relate.
Yeah.
And I'd go up and I'd flip it to that Outlier, and there'd be a war movie. I'd watch it for 2 minutes, then he'd say flip it back. I'd flip it back, and then I'd wait for the next commercial. But one of those had the Frogmen, and I asked my dad, "Hey, who are these guys?" And he said, "Ask your mother." So I asked my mom, and she was a librarian, and we went down to the local library and did some research. And back then, so early '80s, hardly anything written about SEALs. So I looked up frogmen, found out about underwater demolition teams, found out about SEALs. A lot of what was written back then was in an article, newspaper article, or a magazine article. Hardly anything in books. Maybe in a paragraph or two in a couple books, but not much. And most of it was focused on Vietnam at the time, because it was such a watershed moment in special operations history. So I found out from that research that, hey, this book here, this magazine article is saying that these are some of the best special operators in the world, and they're training some of the toughest ever devised by a modern military. So they had me from a very early age. Age 7, I
Yeah.
was all in. And then about age 10, I started reading the same books as my parents. So that kind of laid that foundation. So I had that drive to join the military. I found out what SEALs were. Now I'm reading fiction, because there's no internet just to spend all day on reading about SEALs or Army Special
Yeah.
Forces or whatever. You had to actually put in the work. You had to go there. You had to go to the library. You had to do that research. You had to figure out which magazines these mentioned SEALs, and then you had to go to that article, and then you had to scan and try to find maybe the one sentence or two sentences maybe about SEALs. So I just started building on this foundation, and of course, I'm also reading books on warfare, terrorism, insurgencies, counterinsurgencies, a lot of which I still have today from back then, and started building my library, and
Mhm.
researching about where I wanted to go, what I wanted to do, how to be the best operator I possibly could, best combat leader I possibly could, and doing the physical stuff too. I was doing because I there was no CrossFit or anything back then. So instead, what I'm doing is I'm like there's a film that the Navy produced in I think 68 or 69. It was called Men with Green Faces. And they showed some of the training that SEALs went through. So I was like, okay, I see what they're doing. I'm going to put a rope up in the backyard. Or we had the jungle gym in the backyard. And I saw these guys, doing different pull-ups and stuff like that, different hand positions. I'm like, okay, I'm going to do that. I'm going to sprint my hill. I'm going to climb up the side of the house. I'm going to shoot my bow at an angle. I'm going to jump into this tree. I'm going to rappel down. Like I was doing all that stuff back, all these things that I thought I needed to do in order to get where I wanted to go. So all of these things built on one another, and none of them ever stopped. So reading these thrillers, none of them ever stopped. I just later found new authors, and I continue to read some of those older ones that are still writing today. David Morrell's a dear friend today. Stephen Hunter is a dear friend today. Talk to both those guys almost weekly, and so I just kept reading all these thrillers. At the same time, I'm doing all this academic research on the study of warfare, and then boom, I'm in Iraq and Afghanistan, getting this actual real world experience downrange. So by the time it came for me to transition, I had about as good of a foundation built as possible, because I think it would be weird, or not weird, I think it would be different for me to have woken up one day not having been a reader and then all of a sudden deciding that I wanted to write. Instead, I grew up knowing exactly what I wanted to do. So I got to experience the magic of these books at the time they were written. So I got to read, Last of the Breed by Louis L'Amour, when it came out, and maybe when it came out in paperbacks, maybe a year later. I think it came out in '86. I think I probably read it in '87. And now I have it in hardback though.
Yeah.
And so I had that magic, reading Brotherhood of the Rose when it came out, reading Fraternity of the Stone when it came out, reading all these books, Charm School when it came out. So I just had these great memories reading these books, and I was giving myself this early education in the art of storytelling by masters of the craft. And then my mom introduced me to Joseph Campbell in 1988 through a series of interviews that he did with Bill Moyers on PBS, The Power of Myth. Found out about Hero with a Thousand Faces, and I was enthralled with that, one, with that book, but two, with those series of interviews with Bill Moyers, because they talked about how that influenced George Lucas and Star Wars. And for a kid in 1988, like that's amazing. So I had this foundation that I could then build upon. So I feel very fortunate that I was introduced to reading very early. And it wasn't like my parents forced that on us. It was just natural. It was just what we did. And I think just having books in the house and having, I still can picture the encyclopedias that we had. I can still picture the ones we had from the '70s. And I can picture the ones we had when we switched them out in the '80s. And just having those there, that was my Google search. You had to go there. So now I'm actually starting to collect them from the '50s, '60s, '70s, '80s, and the last ones in the '90s. So I have these on the shelf, and I'm not always going to a computer to look something up. I spend enough time on this computer as it is, and I just like having that visceral feel. And it's also interesting to be able to look and see how things are framed over the years, differently depending on when they were written, or when they were explored through those mediums of encyclopedias. But yeah, so I just feel like I owe it to my parents for just naturally making reading a part of our life. Like it wasn't like, hey, it's time to read. It was just what we did, So I think there's something to that, and that's never stopped. Reading's always been a part of my life, and obviously a huge part of it. So much so that I'm doing what I'm doing today. I just never stopped listening to that calling.
It's pretty clear for folks that have not read your stuff yet. I will say, it's clear that you're not a former SEAL who just decided to write. Like you're coming to this with a tremendous amount of life experience and life dedication to that. And now, with a 7-year-old twins at home, I know that is the pivotal moment that will shape the rest of their lives, right? So whatever they're reading right now.
That's it. Now, a lot of people don't find it right at 7. You have to be very, very fortunate, I guess. But it is important, I think, to listen to that call whenever you hear it.
Yeah.
When you tell someone you want to be a SEAL, especially at a young age, back then really they didn't know what it was. But then when they found out what it was, they just thought you're going to grow out of it. So you get all these, kind of looks like, oh, he'll grow out of it, or he's probably not going to make it, because everybody knows it. As things went on, and there became the 24-hour news cycle, and then we had people heard about what happened to some SEALs in Panama, and then we heard a little bit about Gulf War, and then we heard things were in Time Magazine and Newsweek, and then Richard Marcinko's Rogue Warrior comes out, and so these things just started to build, and people became a little bit more aware of what SEALs were. There was a movie called Navy SEAls with Charles Charlie Sheen and Michael Biehn in the early 90s. SEALs were featured in The Rock and The Abyss. So they were incorporated more into popular culture as well. But point being, there was a little more awareness. And as people became more aware, they also found out that, hey, this training is very difficult, and they just look at you like, oh, he's probably not going to make it. It'll be kind of tough on him when he doesn't make it. Like, that's what you get. Same thing when you tell people you're writing a book. Like, you get the exact same looks.
Right. Yeah. Oh,
they're like, oh, that's great. You can tell in their voice, see it in their eye. That they're really thinking is like, oh, he'll never make it.
Right.
Same thing when you tell people you want to be a SEAL. Exact same looks, exact same tone of voice. Anyway, so point being, I guess, that it's important to just file those things away and because you only have this much bandwidth, and if you're worried about how hard something is, then that's taking up this much. But if you're like, okay, it's tough, and there we go, I'm focusing all this bandwidth on getting where I want to go. So as I was writing, I wasn't worried about how hard it was. I've been thinking about that my whole life. So for me, and I guess I felt this calling at such an early age. To me, it was obvious how it was going to go. Obviously, I was going to be a lifelong reader. I was going to be in the military. I was going to go into the SEAL teams. I was obviously going to make it through training. Then I was going to get out. Then I was going to write a New York Times bestselling novel, and it would be optioned for a film by an A-list star. And that's just how it goes. So that's the amount of thought that I gave to it. Everything else was focused on preparing me for the SEAL teams or writing the best novel I possibly could. And that continues today. Like the 5th novel that I'm writing right now, I have the title already. I know the beginning, middle, and end already. I have, and I do that. I know how the next one starts. I already know how the next one starts, beginning, middle, and end of the 6th one, and that allows me to not be worried about it with this amount of, even if it's just this much. Like, gosh, I hope I can figure out a good title, or oh, I hope I have a good ending for this because I need to figure out how the 6th one starts. Well, that's taking up space in my head that needs to be focused on making the 5th novel the best it can possibly be. So having that title before I start, even if it's just a working title, and knowing the beginning, middle, and end, and knowing how the next one starts, now all my energies are focused right onto this page, making it the best it can possibly be. I'm not worried about anything else. So same thing with, in the larger scale, getting ready for the SEAL teams or just starting down the path to becoming an author.
I wanted to ask you, we only have a couple minutes left. I sort of want to check in with you about the Chris Pratt. And so they've optioned, and you said they bought the rights to that Terminalist pretty early on. What's the status of that? What is it, a film, TV series? What are they?
So it's a series for Amazon Prime, 8-part series right now, and they're filming in LA. Just got back from set about 2 weeks ago, and gosh, it's crazy. There are 350 people working on set. It's like a military operation. You have a fast, in the military, we have this logistics chain, and everybody in the military has to get fed. Well, same thing on set. You have fast food services. In the military, we have an armorer, and that takes care of all the weapons and all that stuff. Guess what? They have an armorer on set right there. When you're done, you hand your weapon back in. You hand your night vision back in. You do all that stuff, and they're accountable for it. Same thing. You have in the military. You have a transportation department. Guess what we have on set? Oh, a transportation department, dealing with all the vehicles and all that sort of thing. In the team, you have a commanding officer. That's Antoine Fuqua. He's the director. And then Chris Pratt, you have as a tactical level leader that's kind of inspiring everybody out there, and just it's amazing. There's so many similarities between a big set like this and the military. And then for this one, there was like 12 guys that I knew from the SEAL teams on set. I knew a few of them were going to be there. A couple were surprises, and we had a great time. And they're acting in it, or they're playing just SEALs in it, or they're doing stunt coordination stuff, or they're being technical advisors. And so we had like a reunion on set, and it was so much fun. It was a blast. So yeah, they're filming it right now, and then should come out sometime in 2022.
Excellent. I look forward to that. And I was telling my wife last night, I did not think I can see Chris Pratt as Reese. But my first default was Matthew Reese from The Americans.
Oh yeah. He's good. I like that guy. Yeah,
he's really good. And you guys look alike, which is the other thing too.
That's crazy. Well,
yeah.
But so I wanted Chris early on, like right when I started writing. I knew that I wanted him to play James Reese because I wanted somebody who needed to take a risk as an actor. I was taking a risk. My family was taking a risk going down this path. And I wanted an actor that needed to take a risk as well. And I wanted someone that was likable. And that's Chris. He's just inherently likable. He's such a great guy. And he needs to do something, I think, that's a little more primal, visceral, violent, dark, gritty. And so it worked worked out time-wise, I think, for him. So I just thought about that as I started writing, and then I had no idea I had a connection to him. But then so I started writing in December 2014. November of 2017, a friend calls from the SEAL teams, and I'd talked to him in about 5 years. And he said he wanted to thank me for a couple of things I did for him in the SEAL teams, and I couldn't even remember what that was.
Mhm.
And he said, well, you sat me down in your office when I was getting out. You talked to me about transition. You introduced me to people in the private sector, and no one did anything like that other than you. And I sincerely appreciate it. And I said, no problem. How's it going? And he said, I heard you have a book coming out. And I said, yeah, I have these galley copies, which are like rough drafts. I didn't even know what a galley. I learned what a galley was like 2 weeks
Yeah.
before.
Yeah.
And I was like, I can send you this galley copy thing. And he's like, yeah, no, I'd love that, but I'd like to give one to a friend of mine. And I said, yeah, no problem. Who's that? And he said, Chris Pratt. I was like, oh, interesting. That's exactly who I thought of playing this role. And so I sent it to my friend Jared, and he read it, and then he gave it to Chris and said, here's your next project. And Chris read it, and then the next week he called and optioned it.
That's amazing. Well, I look forward to seeing that. For the folks who have not read any of the books, I have my own answer to this, but they can jump in anywhere, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what you're supposed to say.
Right, right.
But there's 4 books in the series right now, and I started at the beginning, but I have a really interesting way. I was really very proud of myself for how I figured out how to get people up to speed in The Devil's Hand with what's been going on up to that point, because I worked for the CIA for a little bit, and while I was in the military, I was just went over there for a little bit, and then as part of that, I thought I might go over there full time, and did a lifestyle poly test. So it's like a 2-day polygraph, and yeah, so a lie detector test, and that is the most uncomfortable room on the planet. Like, it is horrible. So I went back to that. And of course, at the time while I was in the polygraph room back in 2007, I think it was, I wasn't necessarily thinking, oh, one day I can use this in a novel. But as I sat down to write, I thought this is a great way to get people up to speed, hook James Reese up to the poly. So it's kind of a cool way to do that in The Devil's Hand. And that was fun, because then I went back and did the research, the academic research, and did a little more research into the poly, what was actually going on in that room. I can still remember how it looked. I remember the wall color. I remember how it smelled. I remember all of it. But so I got to bring that in. But then I didn't know exactly what was going on. I was hooked up to all these sensors and all that sort of thing. But then I did the research, found out exactly what those sensors were measuring, and then I incorporate that into the novel as well. So that was kind of fun.
Yeah, that's pretty great. So yeah, I would say, as somebody who did jump around and started with the most recent one and then went back, I think you can easily, I think you do a nice job of stitching that up, and even making it possible for people to jump in wherever they want. So, Jack, I really appreciate you taking the time with us tonight. It's been great talking with you. I'm looking forward to getting to see Terminalist on screen, but also finishing the other 2 of your novels in the middle. Folks can learn more about you at jackcarr.com, correct?
Yeah, so it's officialjackcarr.com. I think there's like a current salesman or a car dealership somewhere in the Midwest. Jackcarr.com. So I have officialjackcarr.com. So people want to, and I have a reading list too. I was getting a lot of questions about reading selections and that sort of thing. So before I left the military, the SEAL teams, the Naval Special Warfare Center, asked me to put together a professional reading list. So I did that, and I have no idea if they actually used it or not, but I still have it. So I added to it, and I added some of those other books that I read growing up, and now I have this big reading list, and I choose 6 of them each month. Usually, last month I chose a lot more because I went into all the books that I used as research for The Devil's Hand. Then last year at this time, I did one with the 4 novels that really influenced Savage Son. But typically each month there'll be a reading list on that website, and then there's gear guides for the books and for different holidays and things like that. And I just posted one actually right before 5 minutes before I jumped on here, a blog about the Terminalist filming in LA and some behind the scenes from what that was like to be on set. So yeah, people can find a little more information there and sign up for a newsletter. And then I'm Jack Carr USA on the social channels, and I am most active on Instagram, but I'm also on Twitter, and then I think Facebook just reposts from Instagram because it was like way too many for one person to deal with. So Instagram is at Jack Carr USA, and most active there. And I think that's most everything other than the podcast.
Well, I was going to say they can get to the podcast from officialjackcarr.com as well. So thank you again for your time. Stay with me. We'll say goodbye to you off the air, but I want to thank folks for joining us tonight. As Faith mentioned at the top of the show, go to ToledoLibrary.org and you can find out about some of the other authors we have coming up later this month and next month. Thank you all for joining us. And as Jack was mentioning, you can pick up a copy of his book at your local independent bookseller or at the library, of course. So thank you all for joining us for Authors, and we'll see you again soon. Have a good
Thanks for
night.
having me. Take care.